Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. On the April 11th, 2024. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo online morning seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. First of all, I would like to apologize because originally we were planning to organize and deliver this seminar on the April 9th. But unfortunately, we were not able to do so purely because of my own coordination mistake, and then we were not able to put the YouTube link on the announcement page in a timely manner. But very fortunately, we were able to reschedule and organize it today as our speaker kindly agreed to do this today. So today we are going to feature the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update April 2024 edition, subtitled Firm Foundations of Growth. Every spring and fall, each of the regional chief economist offices of the World Bank issue the respective regional economic update. East Asia and the Pacific traditionally goes the first, and this was launched on the March 31st, several days ago. So next 40 minutes, we are going to listen to Elgis Islamaj, who is the senior economist in the office of the chief economist for the East Asia and the Pacific, to share with us main findings of the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update. And after his presentation, I'll read the question that we received from the viewers in advance. And then if you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so by posting your question on the Q&A or chat section on the YouTube screen, or you can send your question through the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can even send a question directly to me by email so that I will read your question on your behalf, asking Elgis to make some comment to respond to your questions. So with that, I'd like to formally welcome and invite the Elgis to come in to kick off the presentation. Elgis, please. Thank you.
Many thanks, Koichi, and many thanks to all the attendants. Hope you can hear me all right and see the presentation. Now so as you said, I've been doing this twice a year for a few years now. And this is our first audience outside our normal media release and World Bank dissemination channel. So it's very important to us. And I'm very happy to be here and answer to your questions after the presentation. For those of you who are seeing this for the first time, I want to apologize in advance because this regional office at the World Bank do not cover high-income countries like Japan. So Japan is not part of our main growth forecast, but I did add one slide that includes Japan that you'll see in this presentation. Just hopefully you're going to see and learn something from that. So let me get started and then we can talk more later. So just to give you an idea, what is the roadmap, what you're going to get out of the next 30 to 40 minutes. 3 main points. First, the region is growing faster than other countries in the world, like on average other EMDs, but slower than before. Trade, finance, and uncertainty are key determinants of economic performance. They have affected the region in this past year or 6 months that we cover in our update, and in the foreseeable near term, in the next year or 2 years, we see these factors as continuing to affect economic activity. And finally, we present some actually novel economic analysis, and I encourage all of you to look at the report for the part 2 of the report, the special focus. And this analysis, this firm-level analysis, highlights a key problem in the region, that leading firms are not playing a leadership role. So first, let me begin by showing you the big picture. So here you see that the region is growing faster than the rest of the world, and this is on average, but we know that, the region does have some high performing countries. But it is growing in almost any country in the region. The forecast for growth in 2024, and this is the same if you also bring into 2025, is slower than growth in the 5 years before the pandemic. So if you compare the blue lines in this figure with the latest orange lines, yellow lines, you're going to see that, for the majority of countries, growth is expected. So basically, is recovering from the pandemic, but at a slower level than it was before the pandemic. Whether this is temporary or reflects a slowdown of growth trajectory is something that we need to wait and see, but also we have some ideas about what is happening and what are the factors that are giving us this picture. So now additionally, so this is what I said is one problem. Another problem is that when we look at the levels of output per capita and compare them with where they were before the pandemic, the good news is that in many of the region's economy, output per capita is higher than before the pandemic. And, of course, China and Vietnam is like 20 and 15% higher than pre-pandemic levels, respectively. But the worrying fact is that in most of the Pacific Island countries, output per capita is below pre-pandemic levels. And the concern is that it has regressed further for some in the most recent years, especially in the last year. So this is where the region is now, right? So growth has recovered, but it's below pre-pandemic levels. Output per capita in most of the countries of the region has surpassed pre-pandemic levels, but not in many Pacific Island economies. Now, the question is why? And, we try to, when we think about giving a big picture, and of course, and let me say it in advance that, in some countries that there's also idiosyncratic factors that affect those countries, but this is the region that broadly fits. So this is a picture that broadly fits developments in the region. So a big picture is that there are some key external factors. For example, trade, recovering global trade, protection, and still tight finance, as well as some domestic factors such as higher debt, limited macro space, and policy uncertainty. All these factors, in one way or another, affect economic growth in the region. Now, let's look at these factors in turn quickly, at least one by one, and then we're going to continue into the most interesting parts of the update. First, there is an expected recovery in trade. Now, I think we've had this picture before, but before, if you close your eyes for a second and just focus on 2022 and 2023, we used to say, oh, global GDP is declining and trade is declining because GDP is going to be lower, but also our growth is going to be lower, and also there's going to be protection. Now, it seems like, oh yeah, we expect trade to decline and GDP to decline, but something maybe not that intuitive is happening. That trade is actually recovering. This is goods trade is actually recovering in 2024 compared to 2023. And it will continue to recover in 2025, but at levels that were not as high as, say, in 2022, and even if you look before the pandemic. Now, at the same time, global GDP is not recovering. It's actually declining further in 2024. So what explains this bounce back in trade? So there are several reasons. First, incomes were eroded by inflation in 2023. And what we've seen along the course of 2023 is inflation falling down and nominal wages going up. So real incomes of the purchasing power of households in advanced economies has gone up. So that is one factor. Second, 2023 was actually a year that when services were being consumed, while goods, but not goods, right? So because people in advanced economies, US, Europe, UK, Japan, they were sitting at home in 2021 and part of 2022, they were purchasing these goods like electronics and other things. And when in 2023, when the pandemic was officially over, then they started traveling, doing more services and not consuming good. But in 2024, there'll be a rebalancing of, of these shifts in consumption towards tradable goods. And finally, 2022, what we saw is that firms, because they were expecting, there was a lot of uncertainty, that they didn't know what's going on, but demand for these tradable goods like electronics were up. They stocked up on inventories, and in 2023 they used these inventories. So now they're going to start to replenish their shelves, their inventories, and 2024, for these reasons, is going to look better than 2023. But again, there are reasons to not be so bullish about the global recovery or about what's happening with trade. Why? Because against the good news of the recovery in trade, there is a concern of increased protectionism. When we look at these trade distorting measures, this is data set documented by the Global Trade Alert, is more than 3,000 new trade distorting measures were introduced in 2023. And this number was like 3 times as much as in 2019. Now, 2/3 of these measures constitute industrial policy measures like subsidies. And the remaining 1/3 are increases in trade protection. And finally, there is still the reality that inflation has come down, but it is not out of the picture yet. Right? And if you looked at the news from the US this morning, for example, you're going to see that there is a concern that the interest rates will remain higher for longer in advanced economies, and that will affect interest rates in the region. Now, let me focus. So we have said some of these things before, so some of these factors have not changed, just we have monitored how they have developed over the last 6 months. But let me stop a bit in one particular area that is a little bit novel. So a quick look at industrial policy. What we can see, and this is thanks to a data set that the IMF put together with, again, the Global Trade Alert that I mentioned, is that the main practitioners of industrial policy are the industrial countries, are the large and also the large developing economies. So essentially, you can think that, okay, the G20 economies are at the forefront of these industrial policy measures. Now, again, these are trade distorting, but one aspect of this industrial policy that we've seen in some countries, in some of these major economies, is that it is motivated by climate goals. So, for example, in China and now in the US, a lot of these subsidies are being devoted to green industries. And therefore, this industrial policy that is creating its own distortions is maybe helping the goal of reducing world emissions. Now, the other side of it is, of course, that when a big economy like China, that is an important destination for the exports of the region's economies, but also, an important competitor for the reason, if it chooses to subsidize its industries, that makes it harder for the region's economies to export. And then when Indonesia, let's say, another country, chooses to limit its exports of essential minerals like nickel, that also may create problems for the countries in the region and also more broadly in the world. And, to top it off, when a very important market for the region, like a destination market like the US, chooses through its Inflation Reduction Act to support its own industries, that too creates a problem. I think in the past update, we focused more on that, where we showed that the exports of the region, both from China and from the other economies in the region to the US, have suffered since the start of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Now, so the region is squeezed a bit, and there's concerns, what would be the implications of these industrial policies, especially for smaller economies in the region that they don't have deep pockets or the institutions to alleviate some of these negative effects, right? So again, it's not all bad news, but there's the good news of the trade recovering, but we should be mindful that protectionism has increasing. Now, on the domestic front, turning to the domestic issues, both private, corporate and household debts, as well as public debt, are higher now than they were before the pandemic. Now, interest rates, because they are higher globally, this limits the scope for interest rates cuts in the region because of concerns about capital flight, depreciation, and what does that mean about inflation. And finally, there is this, and there's the phenomena of policy uncertainty, which is high today both globally and regionally. And there's many measures now that mostly based on this word searches with different algorithms in the computer that gives a sense of what is, and sometimes is political uncertainty, sometimes is economic policy uncertainty. But so it can be both because of political developments, but also political developments, like if there are elections or if there is like gridlock in respective parliaments. And what we see is that uncertainty has roughly increased compared to the pre-pandemic, and this provokes a particular concern because it induces people and firms to have this wait and see attitude, especially towards investment, but also towards consumption. Right? So that in the end limits aggregate demand, so it's not good for economic growth. So now let's take a look at what has been the impact of these external and domestic factors on consumption, investment, and exports. Now, consumption has sustained growth in the region, right? So whenever we go and look at these drivers of growth, and we look at for each country what is driving growth, consumption is up there. After the pandemic has been strong. But when you look at the trends of retail sale, and this pertain primarily to the goods purchases, it's flatter than it was before the pandemic. So while consumption, is contributing to the actual growth, it's not what it was before the pandemic. Now, China presents an interesting picture. Because, again, if you focus, and I'm not showing it here, but if you look at the retail sales in China, it's captured mostly the sales of goods, of tradable goods, then again, the trend is flatter than pre-pandemic. But if you add to it services, so it seems like, the consumption of goods and services is catching up with pre-pandemic trends, and that's good. And again, in China, consumption is driving growth. There are other concerns that I'm just going to mention briefly, some of them. But the problem is that generally, even though China has tried in recent years to structure its demand away from dependence of exports and investment towards consumption in China is still exceptionally low. So, right, that growth would have had a bigger bang for the buck if consumption as a share of GDP was higher, but we know that consumption in China is exceptionally low. And this is not so much because household incomes are relative to GDP, but because Chinese households have high levels of savings. And again, one explanation of this is the precautionary motive, because they don't have strong pension of social protection systems, so people tend to save more for old age or for whatever unexpected shock they face later in life. But another recent reason is that because property prices have fallen so much, there's like a negative wealth effect in China, which is further squeezing consumption. So even though it's somehow catching up with pre-pandemic levels, we don't see like a big euphoria or what we expected more than a year ago that when China is going to open up, it's going to unleash this wave of consumption. Even some people were saying it's going to bring inflation to the rest of the world. So there is that. Now, on the investment, turning to investment, the situation, again, especially in private investment, is a little bit grim because in most countries today, private investment as a share of GDP is lower than it was before the pandemic. Again, the fact that interest rates are high or higher than before the pandemic, corporate debt is high, and also exports have not picked up. These are all factors that dampen private investment, and I think we've shown this in a previous update, and we kind of bring some evidence again together in this update. At the same time, even we see that governments have, in some cases, helped to a certain extent through public investment. Basically, we don't, again, it is not like out there. It's again cautious because we have seen like reduction in fiscal space in many countries. Now let's turn again to China. Right, we go consumption, investment, and then we're going to talk about the exports. And again, China here presents a very interesting development. And I think this is like a new thing that a lot of people are talking about, and everybody's watching out what's going to happen. So what's happening in China is that on aggregate, private investment, or let's say total investment, is decreasing, right? But we also see an interesting situation there, where basically there was a lot of investment in infrastructure and in real estate in China, but now, so and especially the investment in those sectors, it has been declining, but investment in manufacturing has been increasing, especially in the sectors that are cutting edge, like for example, electric machinery is the green. Is the green area over here. The red area is chemical products or the automotive sectors, which we know China has produced a lot of EVs. But these are also the sectors we see which have benefited and are benefiting from support, whether it is direct assistance or privileged access to finance. For example, the rates of interest today in semiconductors industry or computer or auto batteries are significantly lower than interest rates in higher sectors, starting from real estate, infrastructure, and also, the more, I guess, the more service-oriented sectors of the economy. Now, so what we make out of these developments in China on the investment front is that we see a picture of some extent of rebalancing, but now, so whether before the idea was to rebalance, it initially was from exports to, from external dependence to domestic dependence, and from investment and exports to consumption. Now what we are seeing is a rebalancing within, so rebalancing of investment within the sectors of the economy. So it is from real estate and infrastructure towards perhaps some more productive sectors in the economy in manufacturing. But at the same time, while this may end up being productivity increasing, it does raise some concerns about potential mismatches between supply and demand in these sectors, especially if the domestic demand is not there and they have to rely on external demand. When you look at exports, turning to exports now, again, there is a combination of reviving demand, but eroding protectionism means that exports have recovered. So we see a little bit of recovery here, and on average, they're now in positive territory, but not dramatically so. So we don't see like a super boom in exports. And also in services, where we're expecting now the pandemic is over, there's to a large extent recovery in the tourism sectors. and some of the economies in the region depend on tourism a lot, so it's very important to them. But there is this phenomenon of premature plateauing. So in most countries, the number of tourists, but also the spending of tourists, so how much tourists spends, has plateaued at levels before the pandemic, right? And even for the countries that, it seems like tourism has recovered, how much these tourists are spending is way below than it was before the pandemic. That's something to remember. Now, and I think that this is the picture that I think I added. It's probably not in the published presentation, where we do include Japan, is that this protectionism and this changes in trade and industrial policies that started with the trade war between US and China, and then it continued with all those protectionist measures that you saw, is continuing to shift patterns of trade. Like we see that US imports from China have decreased. A lot of countries are benefiting, but notice that, from the region's economies, at least the countries that we cover, the developing EAP, Vietnam is benefiting quite a bit, whereas, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, to some extent, I mean, they're not getting hurt, but less so. So they're not really like booming from whatever is happening with the trade restrictions. And again, when you see at the other side, Chinese imports, then again you see that China has been importing more commodities, including from Russia, but also from Indonesia, other economies. But it has also been importing like less machines and some countries, especially some aligned with the US, are seeing like a decrease of the share of imports, of the share of Chinese imports. Okay, so to bring this all together, we do have some empirical work that this is again just suggestive, but it shows that changes in foreign output. So if we look at the fluctuations in growth in US, China affect the region. So basically, if the US GDP growth declines by 1 percentage point, GDP growth on average in the region will decline by about 0.5 percentage points. And that effect is a little lower for Chinese growth, for the spillovers from growth from China. Now, at the same time, US monetary policy, if there are some methods where you pull out this monetary policy shocks in the US, and if you have like a shock that is negative, it raises interest rates, then again, this will affect real economic activity in China. Now, what we also are seeing is that it is not just the levels, but also uncertainty about future performance abroad. And here, I mean, before I showed you about policy uncertainty that affects the economy, but this is basically US macro uncertainty shock. So basically uncertainty about macroeconomic developments in the US or uncertainty about macroeconomic developments in China negatively affect production, industrial production in the region. Because people are not sure about where, when, and how to invest. And, at this stage, basically what we want to say is that resolving uncertainty everywhere in the world will have large benefits for our region in particular, but maybe emerging markets more generally. Okay, so now shifting gears, hope I gave you a sense of where the region stands, what have been the recent developments, and now we in this update, like in the last update, we take a deeper dive in a special focus chapter, and I'm going to present it's some innovative work that my colleagues did, and builds so it looks at firm level data and builds a regional picture of micro foundations of growth. So to begin with, we highlight some stylized facts, and this is really important. Growth in the region is not driven much by increases in productivity. So what this figure does is decomposes the sources of growth. And I'm starting here with the TFP, which stands for total factor productivity, to show that total productivity, especially in recent years, has not been a major contributor to growth of incomes per capita in the region. Across the region, productivity has been low, and growth instead has been driven by investment, and this is investment in machines, in factories, and maybe a little bit in increases in human capital. Even though, I should put a caveat here that these measures of human capital, are not good, so maybe we're missing something there, but at least if you do a standard decomposition, that's what it shows. Now, the concern is that both investment and productivity growth are now declining. So we are now in this situation where, as I hopefully clearly explained in the last 15 minutes, the region is facing these macro turbulences and at the same time is facing slower productivity and slower investment. So something must be done, right? But in order to devise the right policies, we have to have a clear understanding of what lies behind the slowing growth, especially in productivity. And then we can also talk about investment. Now, first we take a look at, since we gather this firm level data, we first take a look at the advanced economies, and this picture is from advanced OECD countries, the advanced countries, and we say, okay, what would the picture look like in advanced economies? Now, we distinguish between firms that are at the frontier. These are like the more productive firms, think like 5% most productive firms, and the other firms in the economy. And we see that productivity growth in these frontier firms, so they are the first one to come up with the big ideas, big inventions, and use them in their production. So productivity growth is growing much faster in these firms than in the rest of the firms. And especially when we think of, this makes sense, in new digital technologies that have been rapidly adopted by the more advanced firms. Now, when we look at the region, the opposite is happening. So if you look, for example, at first this figure, and then I'm going to add more figures, but I just want to make the point first. The green line shows the laggard firm, the least productive firms, the bottom 10%. Blue line shows the average firm. This is in terms of levels of productivity. And the red lines show the national frontier, the 10% most productive firms. And what we see and what has happened to total factor productivity of this firm is that productivity of laggard firms have been growing faster. This is in contrast to what we saw for OECD economies. And this is not unique to China. It was the first to appear in the chart, but is a feature across the region. Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, at least these are the countries for which we could find detailed data. Now, some of this is good news, right? Because what we're seeing, what this picture suggests, is that there is, within countries, there is a rapid diffusion of technologies. So usually the most productive firms are the first one to get their technologies, and is being spilled over to the less productive firms, and they are catching up, right? So there is like a within country catching up by the relatively less productive firms. And maybe that's how it should be. So this is good news. But as I said before, the problem was that what is happening is is there like less scope for the most productive firms to catch up? Now, when we look at what is happening between the most productive firms in the region and the most productive firms elsewhere, in the advanced economies, right? We see that the frontier, to the gap between, the distance between the productivity of these two firms keeps getting bigger and bigger. So it looks like the regional leaders are falling further and further behind. And what is actually even more puzzling is that this pattern is more pronounced in the digital intensive sectors, where you have the biggest technological opportunities, right? And in the update we've shown a chart, and I think we've shown this before, is that technology is being adopted in the region. So it's not that they're not getting technology. The problem is that even the digitally intensive sectors are falling behind the productivity frontier of other more advanced economies. Right? So this is like our main concerns. So the question that we ask is, why are the leaders, and here we mean the firms, why are the leaders not leading, and what can be done? Now, when we look at some surveys for different firms in the region, and here basically this chart is supposed to present the responses of these firms, but the red bars here represent the answers of the most productive firms, the blue the slightly less productive answers, the green even lower productivity firms, and the least productive firms are not part of this picture, because what we're seeing here is responses relative to the least productive firms. And what these findings show is that the most productive firms complain the most about trade regulations, which restrict access to markets, restricts access to inputs, and prevents them from exploiting economies of scale and participating in global value chains. They also complain about inadequacy of and unevenness of skills from basic to more general levels. They complain about infrastructure, which is basically the quality of transport and the quality of telecommunications. And again, in all these dimensions, which is trade, suggests competition, and capacity, which is within education and infrastructure, the most productive firms are basically find these constraints the most binding. Now, very quickly, in regard to competition, we see less new entry. Now, this new entry generally has been a force for dynamism, but this is, I guess, dynamism in sectors is slowing down throughout the region. This is a problem because, as we have shown, and I think this is again from previous update, for example, if you take services reforms that enhance competition, and services, remember, these are the sectors for the economies in the region where most of the protection is still in place today. And what this chart shows is that the reform of services could lead to productivity increases in services, but also in downstream sectors that use these services. So this is a powerful example, in our opinion, of how much competition could induce firms to adopt new technologies. Now, in management, again, the data that we could find shows that the most advanced economies in the region, which is over here, like compare here, I guess, so compare this here with here, the most advanced firms are further behind their counterparts in the world than the less advanced firms. So basically they are far away the global frontier than other countries. And in infrastructure, even though access to broadband has improved, there is still unevenness within and across countries in the region. So to start wrapping up, The prescriptions at this stage are a little bit cliche as far as World Bank recommendations go, but ideally are informed by what we think is a more nuanced evidence that I just presented. So there is need for increased competition, especially by eliminating explicit barriers in the services sectors and implicit barriers in the goods sectors. We need greater investment in skills and better infrastructure. Just quickly to conclude, this report shows that the region is outperforming the world, but underachieving relative to its own potential. We also shows that firms that are leaders and should be showing the way to all other firms in the countries in terms of productivity growth or productivity improvements are not performing the leadership role. And third, in terms of policy, we need greater macro predictability and, of course, more micro competition. And at the same time, we need to enhance capacity, especially digital and educational, basically improving human capital to improve productivity to ensure long-term growth. Thank you very much. Luigi, back to you.
Thank you very much, Egis, for sharing the main findings of the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific Regional Economic Update, April 2024 edition. So we received some questions in advance, actually in advance to the original scheduled April 9th. But let me read those questions that we received on your behalf. The first one, oh, by the way, these questions came from Sasaki-san. Thank you very much for sending your question as usual. First one, according to the report, economic growth in most Pacific Island countries is still below pre-pandemic levels, while other countries in the regions are growing faster. What would be remedies for these islands? What are the policies that leaders of these countries should introduce and promote further? So this is the first question. Elgis, please. You are unmuted.
Many thanks for the question. It's a very tough question, but I expect nothing less from such a loyal and distinguished audience like yours. So the economic growth in most Pacific Islands is still below pre-pandemic. Now, some of it is, I think I mentioned at the beginning, is relates to idiosyncratic shocks, right? About what is happening in the region. For example, in Tonga, there was a tsunami. The tsunami was it erupted in I think in January 2022, but it devastated much of the tourism infrastructure, and that is needs to be rebuilt, right? And I think the process has been slow because there was also a pandemic going on. Palau, it's a tourist-dependent economy, but it did face some serious setbacks because the flight operations stopped during the pandemic and they have failed to resume. Samoa, I think there was a measles epidemic that happened alongside the COVID infection. In Vanuatu, there was basically huge damage due to a tropical cyclone, I think that happened around October of 2023. Right, and then in some other countries, there was like Tuvalu experienced spending disruptions that were due to delays in procurement. And in Solomon Islands, we saw that there were severe disruptions because of civil unrest, right? And then in other countries, Kiribati had a drought, Micronesia, they had basically normally have like a slow growth potential. So I brought all this and, I think we have included a discussion of this in our update because these are some idiosyncratic factors that, you might say, oh, these are idiosyncratic, it happened, for whatever reason, but they are very telling, right? So on the other hand, you have this reality that COVID in the region happened, came in a little later than in the rest of the world. So when I say the region, I mean the Pacific Islands. So COVID in the Pacific Islands came in a little later than in the rest of the world, and basically it took some time for them to open up and get back to their level. So in some sense, they are still in the phase of recovery. So what we saw in the rest of the region that happened in so that they rock bottom 21, 2022, and then 2020, 2021, and 2022 they start recovering. It will come with some lag in the Pacifics. Second, we saw, and we talked in previous updates, that the increase in prices, especially in commodity prices, that resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, affected economies in the region. It affected even more the Pacific Islands, and these effects are lasting a little longer, right? Because they are remote and transportation there takes longer. Now, these two big factors are gonna, they are recovering, and we're seeing basically them turn to normalcy. But the other idiosyncratic factors I discussed earlier speak to about what can be done. For example, in some countries that are tourism dependent, maybe some external help is needed, form of aid, to focus on how to bring the tourism together, set up the infrastructure that was destroyed, or in the case of Palau, set up, the flight operations and the connectivity. And in some other cases, like for example, in I think it was Tuvalu, right, where you had this problem with government contracts, and this improving the capacity of the government, and this is part of the World Bank operations, are a lot of times devoted towards improving the capacity of the government in those economies, would also help for a more efficient management that will allow whatever funds they have to be distributed in a timely manner, and so on. So let me stop here. Just some suggestions. Again, what I try to say are not inclusive, but I think there's still a lot of things that can be done and make a difference.
Thank you very much, Elgis, for your responses. Next question. Does regional cooperation or regional integration help the firms in the region to obtain relevant skills or management skills, while the analysis says the best managed firms in the region have such skills far below the best, than the best in advanced economies? So the regional integration and the skills question. Thank you.
Again, another great question. So the previous update, when we discussed services, I think that there was a little more on this. So probably this last update, we got so deep into the data that we focus more on identifying the issues than discussing how to solve them. But for example, services sectors are one example where these regional corporations or even more global cooperation would help a lot. I think some examples that we have said in the past, think for example, educating the population or the workforce in the remote Pacific Islands, right? They are spread out a lot, so maybe it would be a more efficient solution for these countries to cooperate and have like one regional hub when these things are happening, or at the same time, harmonizing their practices, say their accounting practices, where you can have like firms that can easily solve the problems across different countries in the region, can go a long way. And allowing the more generally cooperating in allowing the free flow of information and technology. Again, we've shown in the past that will improve innovation for firms in different countries, and which means that it will improve productivity. So yes, and hopefully I gave you couple of examples of how that can happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. The third question is this. There are many elections in key and major countries this year, including the one in US coming up. While it is difficult to say about the result of those elections, but protectionism caused uncertainty, which impacted a lot on the EAP and other regions several years ago. Do you foresee some scenarios or economic analysis for the near future in the region in case the world moving into such direction? Any comment, please?
So again, is the type of questions that, you know, at least when we write the update, that goes through a lot of internal reviews. We try to be careful how we answer it politically. But the answer is yes, and that is the point of why we identified uncertainty as one of the major concerns, and this is true not just domestically, right? You know, if there is domestic turmoil, both in the case of open conflict, like, you know, it was in say Solomon Island, but also if there is a political conflict, you know, if there's an election cycle and there's uncertainty about what's going to happen, two different parties going head in head with completely different policy platforms, then investors don't know which is going to be which, right? So there's this wait and see attitude. Like, you know, if this party wins, are they going to raise taxes? Are they going to lower taxes? So we've seen that in many countries, and that is the case for the region. But more importantly, as the question is insinuating, we are, I guess, at a juncture in the world where, you know, the actions of some big players matter a lot, right? You know, for example, we've seen from the point of view of the US, we've seen, you know, now two administrations that have taken a tough stance of trade practices and you know, how they think things should go with respect to trade with China, has affected not just China but also the rest of the region. Now the question here is, what should these countries do? Right? Sometimes they are caught in the middle, right? And in a series of updates, we have addressed this as best we could, because it's a very good question, and it's something that we're all looking for to answer, but, you know, how to answer it, you know, in a convincing way. So first is, I mean, what we try to do in the updates is a call for these countries not to engage in protectionist policies themselves, right? At least not for the sake of protectionism, because, and we have shown that is welfare reducing. I mean, even if, you know, another country is engaging in protectionist policies, then its best response is to commit to open markets. Whereas in the case of when you have two major economies in the world like US and China fighting, then again, we have shown in the previous update that the best policy response is not to pick sides, but to try to engage in, I mean, ideally you'd have one regional or one global partnership where, you know, you decide on all the trade tariffs, you lower them or you eliminate them depending on what will be the best policy that they decide on. But we haven't seen that. That's too idealistic to ask for. And then what these countries should do is they try not to pick sides, and they try to engage in as many bilateral or multilateral agreements, especially in trade, that they can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess you responded to the question that we received in a very effective manner. So before the wrapping up, any final remarks, final words from you quickly?
But as I said, I want to thank the audience, our most loyal audience, and we appreciate you guys. And again, I want to apologize. We unfortunately do not cover these high-income economies in the region, but there's so many interesting developments in Japan that you guys are probably even more knowledgeable than us, but we are following them closely about how they can affect the region, especially through banking flows, through financial ties, that Japan has a lot of financial ties in the region, and FDI flows. Right, and I guess it's an exciting time, but also a time to be a little concerned about what's going to happen with the world economy and all these ongoing conflicts that will hopefully be resolved, because economic theory and economic evidence says that the best outcome is to lower uncertainty and to incorporate fair and just economic integration.
Great. Our future speaker this morning was Elgiz Islamaj, who is a senior economist in the office of the chief economist for East Asia and the Pacific region, summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update, April 2024 edition, subtitled Firm Foundation of Growth. Elgiz, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we are going to continue featuring the other regional economic update of the World Bank. I think we have 5 more regions to go through, so please stay tuned. And also on May 7th, Tuesday, 8 a.m., we are going to feature the Digital Progress and Trend Report 2023. This has already been announced on our website, but please also join us there. With that, once again, thank you very much for watching the seminar, and see you next time. Thank you.